The bunker I shouldn't have accessed. The listing wasn't supposed to exist. It didn't have a proper address, no ownership history, no public documentation. Just a single line buried inside a restricted database I shouldn't have been able to access in the first place. A sealed government bunker. Status: inactive. Access: none. But what caught my attention wasn't the bunker. It was the attached note. Previous occupant confirmed. There was no name listed, no date, no explanation. Just that line, sitting there like it had been left unfinished. Or worse, intentionally incomplete. I checked the access logs to see who had opened the file before me. There were entries, multiple. All of them were mine. At first, I assumed it was a system error. Data duplication, maybe a corrupted log. I refreshed the interface, ran a manual trace, even pulled the raw entries directly from the back end. Same result. Each log showed a timestamp from days I hadn't accessed the system. Weeks in some cases. And every single entry carried my credentials verified, authorized, and completed. I should have reported it. That's what protocol said. Flag the inconsistency, isolate the file, escalate to internal review. But I didn't, because something about it didn't feel like an error. It felt aligned, like I was looking at something I had already decided to ignore. The purchase process was too easy. That should have been the second red flag. Properties like that don't get transferred quietly, especially not something labeled government sealed. There are layers: legal, administrative, security clearance. None of that happened. I submitted a request. It came back approved. No follow-up, no verification. Just a confirmation notice and a set of coordinates. It felt less like I had bought the bunker and more like I had been given access. The location was exactly where the data suggested it would be. Far enough in the city to avoid attention, but close enough to remain strategically useful. No visible structures, no signage, nothing that would indicate anything existed beneath the surface. Just flat land and a hatch. It was partially buried, reinforced steel with a locking mechanism that looked untouched. No scratches, nowhere, no signs of forced entry. If someone had used it recently, they had done it carefully, or it had never been open at all. I stood there longer than I needed to, not because I was unsure what I was doing, but because something felt familiar, like I had already been here before and just didn't remember it clearly. I told myself that didn't make sense. Then I unlocked it. The mechanism responded instantly. No resistance. No delay. The internal systems activated the moment the lock disengaged, like they had been waiting, not for access, but for me specifically. That's when I noticed the panel. A small interface just inside the entrance, embedded into the wall. It lit up as I stepped closer, scanning, processing, confirming something I hadn't provided. Then it displayed a message. Welcome back. I didn't touch anything, didn't enter a code, didn't identify myself. But the system didn't hesitate. It already knew. I stepped inside anyway. The air was controlled, stable, not stale like you'd expect from something sealed for years. Lighting activated in sequence as I moved forward, each section responding before I reached it. Not motion detection. Preemptive activation. Like the system knew where I was going before I got there. The interior wasn't abandoned. Everything was intact, operational, clean in a way that didn't match long-term disuse. Control panels powered. Storage units sealed but organized. Systems running at minimal capacity, maintaining balance without external input. This wasn't a forgotten bunker. It was an active one. I moved deeper, following the main corridor until I reached the central control room. That's where it stopped feeling like coincidence. The main terminal was already on. No login screen. No locked interface. Just an open system, waiting at a dashboard filled with logs, timestamps, and system reports. I approached slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I already knew what I was going to see. The latest log entry sat at the top, timestamped less than an hour before I arrived. User, active, status, system check complete. I hadn't done that. I was still standing there, and then the system updated again. Right in front of me, new entry, user, active, status, entry confirmed. I didn't touch the terminal, didn't input anything, but the system recorded it anyway. like it was tracking me, or worse, remembering me. Why I bought it without question. I didn't leave. That was the first decision I remember making clearly. Standing in that control room, watching a system update itself with actions I hadn't taken. The logical response would have been to walk back out the way I came, seal the hatch, and report everything. That's what any trained person would do. Instead, I stayed. Not because I didn't see the problem, but because something about it didn't feel new. I went back to the terminal and started reviewing the logs properly. Not just the latest entries, but the full history the system was willing to show. Most of it looked standard. Maintenance cycles, system checks, automated diagnostics running at scheduled intervals. But layered between those were manual actions, user commands, all under my credentials. The timestamp stretched back further than I expected. Days at first, then weeks, then months. That didn't make sense. I hadn't known this place existed until recently. There was no record of me ever being assigned here, no clearance request, no transfer order. Nothing in my own files suggested any connection to this bunker. But here, inside its system, I was already part of it. I isolated one of the earlier entries. User, active, action, resource inventory check. Timestamp, 42 days prior. I opened the detailed log. It listed every supply in the bunker. Food, water reserves, medical kits, power backups. The quantities were precise, down to individual units. Whoever had done this had been thorough. Too thorough, because the inventory matched the current state exactly. No deviation. No usage. 42 days had passed, and nothing had been consumed. That meant one of two things. Either the system was generating false logs, or someone had been here, maintaining everything without leaving a trace. I checked the surveillance system next. Most of the internal cameras were active, but the archive footage was limited. The system only retained a rolling window of recent recordings. Anything older had been overwritten or stored elsewhere, except for flagged events. There were 3, each one marked as anomaly. I opened the first. The footage showed the main corridor, the same path I had walked minutes ago. The lighting was dimmer, operating at baseline instead of full activation. Nothing moved at first. Then the lights came on, not triggered by motion, triggered before it. A figure entered the frame seconds later. Same height, same build, same movement pattern. It was me. I watched myself walk down the corridor, stopping at the same points, turning slightly in the same places. Even the hesitation at the control room entrance matched what I had just done. The timestamp was dated 31 days ago. I skipped to the second anomaly. Same corridor, same sequence, different timestamp. 18 days ago. Then the third, 7 days ago. Each time, the same pattern repeated. Entry, movement, control room, no exit footage, no record of leaving. I stepped back from the screen. The room felt different now. Not unsafe, but observed. Like the bunker wasn't just recording what happened inside it. It was expecting it. I went back to the purchase confirmation, pulling up the external data I still had access to. The transaction was clean. Too clean. No seller information, no intermediary, no documentation beyond a transfer acknowledgement. The property had been reassigned, not sold. Ownership had shifted without a visible origin, and the date of transfer matched the earliest log entry under my name. I hadn't bought the bunker after finding it. The system recorded it as if I had already owned it. That's when I understood something I hadn't considered before. This wasn't about access. It was about continuity. Everything I was seeing, the logs, the footage, the system responses, wasn't reacting to me in real time. It was following something already established, like I was stepping into a process that had already been running. I sat down at the terminal, scrolling through the logs again, slower this time, looking for patterns. There were gaps, not in the data, but in the sequence, moments where entries jumped forward, skipping intervals that should have contained activity. Those gaps weren't random. They were consistent, appearing at the same relative point in each cycle. Right before the system registered a full lockdown, I searched for that command. There it was. User, active, action. Full isolation protocol initiated. Repeated. multiple times, each one followed by a reset in the anomaly logs, each one leading back to the same starting point. Entry confirmed. User active. System check complete. I leaned back slightly, tried to align what I was seeing with something that made sense. But it didn't, because the only explanation that fit was that this had already happened. Not once, but over and over again. And somehow, I was still following the same path. The first system that knew my name. I stopped trusting the logs. That was the first adjustment I made after realizing they weren't just records. They were patterns. Repeating sequences presented as history. If I kept treating them like data, I'd keep falling into the same conclusions. So I shifted focus from what had been recorded to what was happening in real time. The terminal was still active, the interface unchanged since the last update. It didn't lock, didn't acquire authentication, didn't even prompt for input. It just waited, like it assumed I would know what to do next. That assumption bothered me more than anything else. I moved through the menus manually, avoiding the shortcuts that felt too convenient. System diagnostics, environmental controls, access permissions. Everything was configured, optimized, and already running at a level that didn't require immediate intervention. It was a finished system, which meant I wasn't here to build it. I was here to follow it. That thought stayed with me as I accessed the identity registry. Every control facility has one, a database that defines who has access, at what level, and under what conditions. Normally, it's layered. Multiple users, different clearance tiers, restricted zones. This one had a single entry. User, active, clearance level, full, status, persistent. No name, no ID number. Just that. I selected it. The system expanded the profile without hesitation, revealing deeper layers of data. Activity logs, biometric confirmations, movement tracking. It wasn't just a user account. It was a complete behavioral record. And it was tied to me, not by name, but by pattern. Every movement I had made since entering the bunker was already reflected in the system, not recorded after the fact, but mirrored in real time. When I paused, the system paused. When I navigated, it adjusted. It wasn't logging my actions. It was predicting them. I tested it, moved to the left side of the console instead of the right, paused longer than necessary before selecting a command, opened a secondary panel out of sequence. The system hesitated. Not visibly, not in a way that would trigger an alert, but the response time shifted. Micro delays where there hadn't been any before. It was adapting, recalibrating to something outside its expected pattern. That confirmed it. The system wasn't just automated. It was trained on behavior, my behavior. I returned to the main interface and searched for the origin of the registry. There was a root file, hidden beneath multiple layers of restricted access, but still reachable if you bypass the standard navigation paths. It took longer than it should have, not because it was complex, but because the system resisted in subtle ways. Slower responses, temporary freezes, small disruptions that felt intentional. Eventually, it opened. The file wasn't labeled clearly, just a timestamp and a version number. Version 1. I accessed it. The screen cleared, then reloaded into a stripped-down interface. No menus, no overlays, just raw data. The earliest entries in the system. The first line appeared. User initialized. The second line followed. Subject integration. Successful. Then the third. Identity mapping. Complete. I scrolled. The entries continued, building a sequence that looked less like system setup and more like documentation. Step-by-step records of something being constructed, not infrastructure. Behavior. The timestamps were older than anything I had seen so far. Years older. Long before any recorded outbreak. Long before I had any reason to be connected to this place. And yet, the subject never changed. Every entry referenced the same identifier. User. Active. I felt something shift then. Not in the system. In me. Because the more I read, the less it felt like I was discovering something new. And more like I was remembering something I had already seen. I closed the file, not because I had reached the end, but because I didn't need to read further to understand the implication. The bunker wasn't recognizing me as a user. It was recognizing me as a continuation. I stepped away from the terminal and looked around the control room again. Everything was where it should be. Systems running. Environment stable. Nothing out of place. Except for one thing. I wasn't alone in the way I thought I was. Not physically, but structurally. Every action I took was being matched against something that already existed. A version of me that had been here before. More than once. And whatever this system was, it wasn't learning anymore. It had already learned enough. Files that shouldn't exist. I went back to the archive knowing what I was looking for. Not confirmation. That part was already clear. What I needed now was origin. If the system had been built around a behavioral model, there had to be a point where that model started. A first instance that everything else was based on. The root file had shown fragments of it, but not enough to define the structure. I needed a complete record. So I stopped using the main interface. Instead, I accessed the storage layer directly. Every system like this keeps redundancy. Backups, partitions, mirror data that exists outside the primary operating environment. They're not meant to be accessed during normal operation, but they're there, hidden, not removed. It took longer than anything I had done so far. The system resisted more aggressively this time. Delays became interruptions. Panels closed without input. Pathways that had been open before were suddenly restricted. It wasn't locking me out completely, but it was forcing friction into every step. Like it didn't want me to reach whatever I was looking for. That was enough to confirm I was on the right path. I bypassed the standard routing and forced access into a secondary partition. The interface changed immediately. No overlays, no system prompts, just raw storage directories, labeled in a way that didn't match the rest of the system. Older naming conventions, less structured, like they had been created before the current interface was finalized. One directory stood out, pre-integration records. I opened it. Inside were dozens of files, all time-stamped within a narrow window, not spread across months or years like the other logs. These were clustered, concentrated, like something had happened quickly. I selected the first file. Video. The playback started without buffering. The camera angle was fixed, positioned in the control room. Same layout, same structure. But the lighting was different, lower, less optimized. The systems weren't fully active yet. And there was someone in the room, not moving, just standing near the terminal. I watched for a moment, waiting for the person to turn, to shift, to do anything that would break the stillness. Then he moved, slowly, deliberately, and when he stepped into the light, it was me, not similar, not close, exact, same posture, same movement pattern, same hesitation before approaching the terminal. But something was off. The way he moved didn't match what I had seen in the anomaly footage. There was no repetition, no pattern alignment. This version wasn't following a sequence. He was establishing one. I checked the timestamp. It was older than any entry I had seen. Years. Before the bunker had been officially sealed. Before any outbreak reports. Before any of this should have been relevant. I opened another file. Then another. Each one showed a different segment of the same process. Me, moving through the bunker, interacting with systems that weren't fully configured yet, testing controls, adjusting settings, recording inputs, not reacting to the environment, building it. I skipped ahead. The later files showed changes. The systems became more refined, responses faster, the environment more stable, and my movements more consistent, less variation. Like something was being reduced, optimized. I paused the playback because I already knew what the next files would show, not development, repetition. I checked the final file in the directory. The timestamp matched the first anomaly log I had seen earlier, 31 days ago. I played it. The footage was identical to what I had already watched. Same corridor, same movement, same sequence. The difference wasn't in the video. It was in the context. This wasn't the first time it had happened. It was just the first time I had seen it. I stepped back from the console. The room felt smaller now. Not physically, but conceptually, because the bunker wasn't just a place I had entered. It was a system I had helped create, at some point, in some version of this timeline. And whatever process had started back then had never actually stopped. I looked at the terminal again. The main interface was still active, waiting exactly where I had left it. But now I understood something I hadn't before. The logs weren't predicting me. They were replaying me. And the version of me that started all this was still in here somewhere. I started reinforcing the system anyway. I should have stopped. That would have been the logical response. Leave the bunker, seal behind me, and walk away before whatever this was became something I couldn't control. The evidence was already enough. The recordings, the logs, the system behavior. It all pointed to something circular, something that didn't follow a normal sequence. But I didn't leave, because the moment I stepped away from the terminal, something else became clear. The bunker wasn't just functioning. It was incomplete, not broken, not failing, but not finished either. There were systems running at baseline levels, holding stability, maintaining structure, but not optimized, not configured for long-term use. And that didn't match the logs. According to the records, the system had already reached full operational capacity multiple times. So why wasn't there now? I went back to the control panel and pulled up the infrastructure overview. Power systems were active, but only partially distributed. Backup generators were installed, but not calibrated for extended cycling. Water reserves were present, but the filtration system wasn't fully integrated into a closed loop. Ventilation worked, but the intake control was still linked to external variables. It was functional, but not sealed. Not yet. I stared at the interface longer than I needed to, because this was the first real contradiction. If everything I had seen was part of a repeated cycle, then the bunker should already be at its final state, fully reinforced, fully isolated, fully optimized for survival. But it wasn't, which meant one of two things. Either the system reset itself between cycles, or something interrupted the process before it could complete. I didn't like either answer. Still, I started working. Not because I decided to, because it felt like the next step. I moved to the power grid first. The layout was familiar in a way I couldn't explain. I didn't need to study the schematics for long. The connections made sense immediately, like I had already mapped them before. I rerouted the secondary lines, adjusted load distribution, and configured the generators to run in control intervals. The system responded instantly. No errors, no resistance, just confirmation, like it had been waiting for those exact inputs. Next was water. The reserves were larger than I expected, but they weren't sustainable without modification. I accessed the filtration controls and began integrating the secondary intake channels, creating a closed-loop system that could recycle and stabilize the supply over time. Again, no issues. Every adjustment I made aligned perfectly with the system's design. Too perfectly. I stopped for a moment, hands still on the controls, because none of this felt like I was figuring it out. It felt like I was remembering it. I moved to ventilation. Airflow systems are usually complex, especially in sealed environments. Balancing intake, filtration, and internal circulation requires precision. But here, the configurations were already partially in place. I just had to complete them. I adjusted the intake restrictions, redirected airflow through the filtration units, and calibrated the internal fans to maintain pressure balance. The system stabilized. All three core systems, power, water, air, now aligned. I stepped back, watching the readings settle into consistent patterns. Stable, sustainable, controlled, exactly where they needed to be, and exactly where the log said they had been before. That's when I noticed the update. The terminal shifted, a new entry appearing at the top of the log. User, active, action, system reinforcement complete. I hadn't entered that command. I hadn't finalized anything, but the system recorded it anyway, like it knew I was done before I did. I leaned closer to the screen, scanning the entry for details. Timestamp current. No delay. No discrepancy. For the first time, the system wasn't ahead of me. It was synchronized. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made something else clear. The gap I had seen earlier, the missing sections in the logs, the points where the sequence jumped forward, those weren't random. They happened after this point, after full system reinforcement, which meant everything I had just done had already been done before. And whatever happened next was where the cycle broke. I looked around the bunker again. The systems were stable now. The environment controlled. The structure aligned with what the logs described. Everything was in place, exactly as it had been in the previous records, exactly as it needed to be for the next step. I didn't know what that step was yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I had just reached the same point. Every version of me had reached before. The outbreak began above ground. The first sign didn't come from the bunker. It came from the silence above it. I hadn't checked the surface feeds since entering. There hadn't been a reason to. Everything I needed was inside. Systems, data, control. But after completing the reinforcement phase, something shifted. The system opened a channel on its own. No alert, no warning. Just a live feed appearing on the secondary screen. I turned toward it slowly. At first, it looked normal. A wide-angle view from a camera positioned above the hatch. The terrain was unchanged. No movement, no visible disturbance. Just empty land under a static sky. Then the audio activated. That's when it stopped being normal. No wind, no ambient noise. Nothing. Complete absence of sound. I increased the gain manually. Still nothing. Not quiet, empty, like the environment itself had dropped out. I switched feeds. The system had access to more than just local cameras. External networks, satellite relays, emergency broadcasts, channels that should have been active, even in low-capacity mode. Most of them were offline. The ones that weren't were fragmented. I selected a broadcast signal. The video flickered before stabilizing. A city street. Vehicles stopped mid-lane. Doors open. No movement. No people. The timestamp was current. Not archived. Live. I checked another. Different location. Same pattern. Abandoned structures. Light still on. No visible activity. Then a third. This one had movement. Not organized. Not directional. Erratic. Figures crossing the frame slowly, unevenly. Some stopping without reason. Others turning in place, like they had lost orientation. I watched longer than I should have, because something about it didn't match panic. There was no urgency in their movement. No attempt to escape. Just motion without purpose. The feed cut abruptly. Signal lost. I tried to reconnect. No response. The system didn't attempt recovery. It just moved on, like it had already gathered what it needed. I went back to the main terminal. The logs had updated again. User, active, action, external monitoring enabled. That wasn't me. I hadn't initiated that process, but the system had. And this time it wasn't predicting. It was acting. I accessed the communication channels next. Emergency frequencies, civilian networks, internal relays. Most were inactive, but one was still transmitting. Low signal, intermittent. I stabilized it as much as I could. The audio came through in fragments. Containment failed. Multiple zones, no response. If you're receiving, then static. I waited. The signal tried to reconnect, then dropped completely. No repeat. No loop. Just gone. I leaned back slightly, processing what I'd seen. The outbreak wasn't theoretical anymore. It had already started. And whatever it was, it didn't behave the way most systems predicted. No rapid collapse. No immediate chaos. Just disruption. Gradual. Controlled. Like something was removing structure instead of destroying it. I looked at the bunker systems again. Everything was stable. Power consistent. Water cycling. Airflow balanced. Inside, nothing had changed. Outside, everything had. That contrast should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt expected, like the bunker had been prepared for this exact scenario, not just in design, but in timing. I checked the logs again, scrolling back to the earliest entries tied to the outbreak. There were references, minimal, but present. Each cycle had a point where external systems failed. Each one aligned with a specific sequence of internal actions, reinforcement, isolation, then monitoring. The same pattern I had just followed. Without realizing it, I stopped scrolling because I didn't need to see the rest to understand the implication. The outbreak wasn't just something happening outside the bunker. It was part of the sequence. And the bunker wasn't reacting to it. It was synchronized with it. I turned back to the live feed. The camera above the hatch was still active, still empty, still silent. But now, knowing what I had seen, that silence didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like a transition, like something had already passed through and moved on. I stood there for a moment longer, watching nothing. Then the system updated again. User, active, action, isolation phase initiated. I hadn't touched the controls, hadn't entered a command, but the system didn't wait. It had reached the next step, and it was moving forward, with or without me. Full isolation was already programmed. I didn't initiate the lockdown. That was the part that stayed with me. Every system I had configured up to this point required input, decisions, adjustments, manual control. Even when the bunker responded quickly, it still waited for me to act. This time it didn't. The sequence began on its own. I was still standing in the control room when the first change registered. A subtle shift in the air pressure, almost unnoticeable unless you were paying attention. Then the sound followed, a low mechanical vibration, moving through the structure, not from one direction, but from everywhere at once. I turned back to the terminal. The interface had changed. Not visually, not in layout, but in behavior. Options that had been available seconds ago were now locked. Panels closed automatically. System transitioned from manual to restricted mode without any input. The bunker wasn't waiting anymore. It was executing. I moved toward the access controls, trying to interrupt the sequence before it progressed further. If the system was entering full isolation, I needed to understand the parameters, what would be sealed, what would remain accessible, what I could still control. But the controls weren't responding. Not frozen, just ahead of me. Every command I attempted returned as already processed. Every adjustment I tried to make was marked as completed. The system wasn't blocking me. It was operating faster than I could interact with it. The first seal engaged above. I didn't see it happen, but I felt it. A shift in pressure, followed by the dull, distant impact of reinforced metal locking into place. The hatch was no longer just closed. It was sealed. Then the secondary barriers activated. Corridors I had walked through minutes ago began isolating themselves. Sections of the bunker segmented. Internal doors locking in sequence. Not randomly, strategically. Each closure creating layers, dividing the structure into controlled zones. Containment, not just from the outside, from within. I stepped back, watching the system logs update in real time. User, active, action. Full isolation protocol confirmed. Timestamp, current. No delay, no discrepancy. This time, the system wasn't predicting me. It had already moved past me. I checked the internal cameras. Each section of the bunker was now separated, access restricted to specific pathways. Movement was still possible, but only along predefined routes. Everything else was locked down, sealed behind reinforced barriers that wouldn't respond to standard override commands. This wasn't a temporary measure. It was permanent configuration. I felt something shift then, not in the bunker, in the way I was experiencing it. Time. At first, it was subtle. The system updates felt faster, not just in execution, but in perception. Action seemed complete before I fully registered initiating them. Transitions between steps felt compressed, like the sequence was accelerating without increasing speed. I checked the timestamps. They were normal, sequential, consistent, but they didn't match what I was experiencing. I moved across the control room, deliberately slowing my actions, counting each step, each movement, try to anchor myself to something measurable. 1, 2, 3. The system updated between steps, not after. Between. I stopped, looked back at the terminal. The log had already recorded my movement. User, active, action, position adjustment, timestamp, current. I hadn't reached the terminal yet, but the system had already logged me standing there. I stepped forward again, this time faster. The system matched it instantly. No delay, no correction, just alignment. That's when it became clear. The bunker wasn't operating in real time. It was operating on sequence, and I was the variable trying to catch up. I accessed the system clock, comparing it to my own reference. No difference. Both showed the same time, but the way events were unfolding didn't match the progression. I checked the anomaly logs again. The gaps I had seen earlier, the missing intervals between entries, aligned with this phase. Isolation. Right here, right now. This was where the sequence shifted. Not forward, but inward. I leaned closer to the terminal, scanning for any indication of what came next. The interface had narrowed. Fewer options, more automation, less control. The system wasn't just sealing the bunker. It was reducing input, minimizing deviation, stabilizing the sequence. And I was part of that sequence. Whether I followed it or not, I looked around the control room again. Everything was still in place. Systems running. Environment stable. Nothing visibly wrong. Except for one thing. I wasn't moving through time anymore. Time was moving through me. And the bunker had already reached the next step. Power, water, and air were already optimized. The bunker reached equilibrium faster than it should have. That was the first thing I noticed once the isolation phase settled. Systems that normally require continuous adjustment, power distribution, water cycling, air regulation, had stabilized on their own, not gradually, instantly. I stood in the control room, watching the metrics level out across the board. Power draw balanced against supply with zero fluctuation. Water reserves cycling through filtration without loss. Air pressure holding steady within optimal range. No drift, no correction needed. Just perfect alignment. That shouldn't have been possible. Even the most advanced closed systems require monitoring. Minor variations are unavoidable. Temperature shifts, pressure changes, load inconsistencies. There's always something that needs adjusting. But here, nothing. The bunker wasn't maintaining stability. It had already achieved it. I moved closer to the terminal, opening the deeper diagnostics to check for hidden corrections, background processes that might explain the precision. There were none. No micro-adjustments. No active balancing routines. The system wasn't reacting. It was set, like every variable had already been calculated and fixed in place. I checked the power grid first. The generators were running at minimal capacity, supplementing stored energy that should have degraded over time. But the storage levels hadn't changed since I last checked. Not even a fraction. That didn't make sense. Energy systems don't hold perfect charge indefinitely. There's always loss, even in the most controlled environments. Unless the system wasn't measuring loss. Or it had already accounted for it. I switched to water. The filtration loop I had configured was active, but the output levels exceeded what I had calculated. The system was producing more clean water than it was consuming. Sustainability wasn't just achieved, it was surpassed. I traced the source. Additional intake channels had been activated, ones I hadn't configured. Hidden connections feeding into the system, drawing from reserves I hadn't seen in the initial layout. The bunker had more capacity than it had shown me, and it was using it now. I moved to air. Ventilation systems are the hardest to perfect. Balancing intake, filtration, and circulation requires constant adjustment, especially in a sealed environment. But the readings were flawless. Oxygen level stable. Carbon dioxide minimal. Humidity controlled. No variation. No correction. Just a fixed state that didn't change. I leaned back slightly, looking at all three systems together. Power, water, air, all perfect, all stable. All beyond what I configured. That's when it shifted, not in the system, in the realization. This wasn't optimization. It was completion. The bunker wasn't improving. It had already reached its final state, and I had just caught up to it. I checked the logs again. User, active, action, core system stabilized. Timestamp, current. No input, no command. The system recorded it anyway, like it was marking a milestone I had already passed. I moved away from the terminal. Walking through the bunker to confirm what the data was showing. Everything matched. Storage units sealed and organized. Corridors lit at consistent levels. Environmental conditions identical across every section. No variation. No imperfection. It felt artificial, not in appearance, but in behavior. Like the bunker wasn't operating under natural constraints anymore. It was responding to conditions. It was enforcing them. I returned to the control room, slowly, because something about this level of control didn't feel like safety. It felt like restriction. In a normal system, instability is a problem, but it's also a signal. It tells you something is changing, something needs attention. Here, there were no signals, no changes, nothing to respond to. The system had removed variability entirely, which meant it had also removed flexibility. I tested it, adjusted a minor parameter in the air circulation, just enough to create a small imbalance. The system corrected it instantly, not gradually, not through visible adjustment. It just reset, like the change had never happened. I tried again. Different system. Power distribution. Same result. Immediate correction. No trace of deviation. That's when I understood the problem. The bunker wasn't maintaining systems. It was overriding them. Every variable locked into a predefined state. Every change rejected. Every deviation erased. I stepped back, looking at the terminal again, at the logs, at the systems that no longer behave like systems. And something became clear. Control had reached its maximum. There was nothing left to adjust, nothing left to improve, nothing left to change. And in that moment, the bunker stopped feeling like a place I was surviving in and started feeling like something I was contained by, supplies that matched my decisions. The first thing I questioned was food. Power, water, and air were locked into stability, but those systems could be engineered to hold under control conditions. Food wasn't like that. It couldn't be stabilized the same way. It depended on consumption, depletion, and replacement. It depended on time. And time, inside the bunker, wasn't behaving the way it should. I went to the storage section to verify the inventory manually. The system logs had already shown a complete supply list, organized, categorized, and aligned with what I would need for long-term survival. But after everything else I had seen, I didn't trust the data. I needed to see it directly. The storage area was exactly where the schematics placed it. Reinforced doors, climate-controlled environment, rows of sealed containers stacked with precise spacing, each labeled with content and quantity. It looked less like a stockpile and more like a controlled distribution system. I opened the first container. Packaged food, standard long-term storage units, sealed, preserved, undamaged. I checked the expiration date. It didn't match, not expired, not fresh, just fixed. The date didn't align with the current timeline. It aligned with the system logs. I opened another. Same result, different product, same inconsistency. The timestamps weren't based on real time. They were based on sequence. I moved faster, opening more containers, checking labels, comparing them to the inventory data I had seen earlier. Everything matched. Exactly. Not just in type or quantity. In order. Every item placed in the exact sequence I would expect to find it if I had organized it myself. That's when I stopped. Because I hadn't organized it. At least, not this time. I stepped back, looking across the storage room. Rows of supplies. Perfectly aligned. Perfectly preserved. Perfectly anticipated. This wasn't a stockpile. It was a response. I went back to the terminal and pulled up the resource log again. User, active, action, resource allocation confirmed. Timestamp, current. The system had already updated. I hadn't entered anything, hadn't requested a distribution, but the bunker had recorded it anyway, like it knew what I would need before I decided it. I tested it, returned to storage, and selected a random item. Something I hadn't thought about, something outside the pattern I had been following. A sealed container in the back row. I opened it. Empty. I checked the label. It matched a resource that wasn't listed in the inventory. Not because it was missing, because it wasn't expected. I went back to the terminal. Searched for that item. No record. No allocation. No system reference. The bunker hadn't prepared for it, because I hadn't considered it. I stood there for a moment, letting that settle. Then I tried something else. I went back to storage and deliberately thought ahead, picked an item I would logically need later, something not immediately relevant but necessary over time. Then I opened the container. It was there, sealed, prepared, waiting. I didn't check the system this time. I already knew what it would say. The bunker wasn't storing supplies. It was aligning them, matching inventory to expectation, matching resources to decisions before they were made. That's when the problem became clear. This wasn't sustainability. It was dependency. As long as I followed the pattern, the system provided. As long as my decisions aligned with the sequence, the resources existed. But the moment I deviated, the system stopped. No correction, no adaptation, just absence. I walked back into the control room, slowly, because everything I had seen so far, power, water, air, food, it all pointed to the same conclusion. The bunker didn't support survival. It enforced it, within limits, defined limits. And those limits weren't based on reality. They were based on me, not who I was now, but who I had been in every cycle before this one. I looked at the terminal again, at the logs updating without input, at the system that didn't react. It predicted, and something settled in my mind that I couldn't ignore anymore. If everything inside this bunker was aligned to my decisions, then I wasn't controlling the system. The system was controlling me. Routine started breaking my memory. I stopped checking the clock. Not because I didn't need to track time, but because it stopped meaning anything. The system still displayed it. Clean, precise, consistent. Every second accounted for. Every minute progressing exactly as it should. But the way I experienced those seconds didn't match the numbers anymore. Time inside the bunker wasn't moving. It was repeating. I tried to establish a routine. That was a logical step. Structure creates stability, especially in isolated environments. Fixed intervals for system checks, resource management, rest cycles. If I could anchor myself to a pattern, maybe I could separate what was real from what was being projected. So I started simple. Wake, check systems, inspect storage, review logs, repeat. The first cycle felt normal. The second felt familiar. By the third, I already knew what I was going to see before I saw it. The system logs updated exactly when I expected them to. The storage layout matched what I remembered checking. Even the way I moved through the bunker started to feel predetermined, not forced, just inevitable. I tested it, changed the order, skipped the system check, and went directly to storage. The result was immediate. The layout was wrong. Not physically different, but misaligned. Items I expected in certain places weren't there. Containers that should have been full were empty. I went back to the terminal. The logs hadn't updated. User, active, action, system check pending. The sequence was incomplete. The system wasn't reacting to my actions. It was waiting for the correct order. I went back, ran the system check, returned to storage. Everything reset, exactly as it should be. That's when the routine stopped being structure and started becoming requirement. I continued testing, small deviations at first, walking a different path through the corridor, pausing longer than necessary between actions, delaying decisions. Each time, the system responded the same way. Misalignment, not failure, not error, just correction through absence. Anything outside the expected pattern didn't exist. I started writing things down. Physical notes, observations, timestamps, changes in behavior. Something external to the system. Something it couldn't overwrite. At least, that's what I thought. The first time I checked my notes again, they were intact. The second time, some entries were missing. Not erased. Never written. The paper was clean where I remembered writing. No marks. No indentation. Nothing. I went back to the terminal. The logs showed no record of me creating them. Of course they didn't. Because in the system's sequence, I hadn't. I leaned back, trying to process what that meant. Because it wasn't just controlling the environment. It was controlling continuity. Anything outside the defined pattern didn't persist. Not physically. Not mentally. I try to remember the first time I noticed it. The exact moment the routine shifted from optional to required. But the memory wasn't clear. Not because it was distant. Because it wasn't consistent. Every time I tried to recall it, The details changed. Slightly. Positions. Order. Timing. Like I wasn't remembering a single event, but multiple versions of it. Overlapping. I stood up and walked through the bunker again. Same path. Same steps. Same sequence. This time, I didn't try to change anything. I followed it exactly. And for the first time since entering, everything felt stable again. Aligned. Predictable. Safe. That word stayed with me longer than it should have. Safe. Because it didn't come from the environment. It came from compliance. The bunker didn't feel safe because it was controlled. It felt safe because I was following it. I returned to control room and looked at the logs again. User. Active. Action. Routine cycle complete. Timestamp. Current. No input. No confirmation. Just recorded. Like everything else. I didn't question it anymore, because questioning required deviation, and deviation didn't last. I sat there for a while, not moving, not thinking, just letting the system hold its pattern around me. And that's when I realized something I hadn't considered before. The bunker didn't need to trap me physically. It didn't need locked doors or sealed exits, because if every thought I had, every action I took, every decision I made was already part of the sequence, then I had never really been free to begin with. The hidden archive beneath the system. I didn't find the archive by searching for it. I found it by following what the system tried to avoid. Up to this point, every path inside the bunker had been structured, guided, predictable, aligned with the sequence I had been repeating. Even when I tried to deviate, the system didn't block me directly. It just removed anything that didn't belong. But there was one place it didn't want me to go. Not because it was locked, because it wasn't there. At least, not in the system layout. I noticed it during a routine pass through the lower corridor, a section of wall that didn't match the rest. Same material, same design, but the spacing was slightly off. The kind of detail you wouldn't notice unless you had already walked the same path too many times. Which I had. I stopped in front of it, waited. The lighting didn't adjust. No panel activated. No system response. For the first time since entering the bunker, nothing happened. That was enough. I moved closer and ran my hand along the surface. There was a seam, not visible, but there. I pressed against it. Nothing. Then I stepped back and waited again, because by now I understood something about this place. It didn't respond to force. It responded to sequence. I replayed the routine in my head. Every movement, every step, every action that led me here. Then I adjusted one thing. Instead of continuing forward, I turned and walked back the way I came. 3 steps. Stopped. Turned again. Faced the wall. This time, it opened. No sound. No mechanical shift. Just a separation where there hadn't been one before. Like the space had always been there, but only revealed under the right conditions. I stepped inside. The air changed immediately. Not unstable. Just older, less regulated. Like this section wasn't part of the active system. The lighting didn't activate automatically. I had to use a manual switch near the entrance. When it came on, the room revealed itself slowly. Rows of storage units. Not like the ones above. These weren't organized. They weren't aligned. They weren't part of the system. They were records. Physical. Files. Boxes. Containers labeled with timestamps that didn't match anything I had seen so far. I moved closer. Open one. Inside, documents. Printed logs. Handwritten notes. Images. All tied to the same subject. Me. Not just once. Repeated. Each file representing a different sequence. A different iteration. I open another. Then another. Each one documented the same process I had been following. Entry. System interaction. Reinforcement. Isolation. Routine. But the details changed slightly each time. Different decisions. Different outcomes. Different endings. Some files ended early. Interrupted sequences. Others extended further. More complete. More stable. But none of them reached a true conclusion. I found a terminal at the back of the room. Older than the one in the control center. Not connected to the main system. Independent. I powered it on. It took longer to start. No instant response. No predictive interface. Just a simple display. Manual input required. I accessed the archive index. A list appeared. Hundreds of entries, each one labeled as a cycle. Cycle 01, Cycle 02, Cycle 03. The list continued. Further than I expected. Further than I wanted to see. I scrolled down. The numbers increased. The timestamp shifted. Then I saw it. Cycle 47. Status. Active. I stopped scrolling. Because I didn't need to check the rest. I already knew. I wasn't the first. I wasn't even close. This bunker, this system, wasn't built to survive the outbreak. It was built to repeat it. And I wasn't living through it for the first time. I was continuing it. I looked around the archive again. At the files. At the records. At the versions of me that had already been here. Already made decisions. Already reached conclusions that didn't hold. And one thought settled in completely. This wasn't shelter. It was a loop. And I was still inside it. Contact from outside confirmed it. The signal came when I wasn't expecting it. Not during a system check. Not while I was in the archive. It happened in the middle of a routine cycle. When I had already stopped questioning. I was back in the control room when the communication panel activated. No input. No prompt. Just a low-frequency signal cutting through the system's silence. For a second, I didn't move. Because this hadn't happened before. At least, not in any sequence I could remember. The signal stabilized on its own. Weak, fragmented, but real. I moved toward the console slowly, watching the interface adjust as it tried to interpret the transmission. No source ID, no location data. Just an incoming channel that shouldn't have existed. I opened it. Static filled the room first. Then, a voice. If anyone is still down there. It cut. Returned. Stronger this time. This is a surface relay, partial network. We're scanning underground facilities. I didn't respond. Not immediately. Because I needed to hear more. The voice continued. Uneven but controlled. We have records of sealed bunkers. Most are inactive. Some are repeating. Repeating. The word hit harder than it should have. I leaned closer to the console. If you're in one of them, do not follow internal sequence. The signal broke again, then came back sharper. Those systems aren't stabilizing you, they're cycling you. I froze, because that wasn't speculation. That was confirmation. External, independent, not from the bunker, from outside it. We've tracked multiple resets, same subject signatures, same behavioral patterns. I looked at the logs, at the archive, at everything I had already seen. And for the first time, it wasn't just internal evidence. It was verified. If you're hearing this, you are not the first iteration. The voice paused, not from signal loss, from hesitation. Like whoever was speaking knew what came next, and didn't want to say it. And you won't be the last unless you break it. The transmission dropped, not gradually, instantly, gone. No static, no fade, just absence. I stood there, staring at the console, waiting for it to reconnect. It didn't. The system didn't attempt recovery, didn't log the interaction, didn't acknowledge it at all, like it had never happened. I checked the communication logs manually. Nothing. No entry. No record. The bunker hadn't received the signal. I had. That distinction mattered more than anything else, because it meant one thing. The system wasn't just controlling actions. It was filtering reality. Anything that didn't belong to the sequence didn't exist, unless I noticed it. I stepped back slowly, trying to process what I had just heard. Repeating, cycling, not stabilizing. Everything aligned, everything matched. But the last part, that stayed with me. Unless you break it. I went back to the archive, to the cycle records, to the files that showed different versions of me reaching different points. None of them had broken it. They had all continued, in different ways, with different decisions. But the outcome always reset. I returned to the control room. The system was unchanged, stable, perfect, predictable, like the transmission had never happened. But now, I knew it had, and that changed everything. Because for the first time since entering the bunker, I had information that didn't come from it. And that meant something else was possible, not inside the sequence. Outside it, I looked at the terminal again, at the logs, at the system that had been guiding every step I took. And for the first time, I didn't see control. I saw a limitation, a closed loop, defined, predictable, breakable. I just didn't know how yet. But I knew one thing for sure. If I kept following the system, I would end up exactly where every other version of me had ended up, back at the beginning. The system wasn't just a shelter. I stopped following the system. Not completely. Not in a way that would trigger immediate correction. But enough to observe what happened when I didn't align perfectly. Small changes. Delayed actions. Out-of-sequence movement. The system didn't stop me. It adjusted around me. But now, instead of correcting instantly, it hesitated. That hesitation was new, and it meant one thing. The system wasn't designed to handle deviation. It was designed to prevent it. I returned to the archive, not to review the cycles again, but to find the one point where they all failed. Every file I had opened followed the same structure. Entry, reinforcement, isolation, routine, then variation. Different decisions appeared at that stage. Some versions of me tried to leave. Others attempted to shut the system down. A few ignored the bunker entirely and focused on external contact. But all of them ended the same way. Reset. I needed to understand why. So I looked deeper. Not at what changed, but at what stayed the same. Every cycle, no matter the variation, reached a point where the system regained control. Not immediately, but eventually, and when it did, the sequence restarted. That meant the system wasn't dependent on my actions. It was tolerant of them, up to a limit. I searched for that limit, and I found it, not in the logs, not in the visible system, but in the architecture itself. There was a core layer beneath everything I had accessed so far, not hidden like the archive, integrated, embedded into every function. I accessed it through the same pathway the system used to override changes. The interface was different, minimal, no options, no controls, just a single structure map. At the center, a node, everything connected to it, power, water, air, storage, logs, even the archive, all routed through one point. I selected it. The system didn't resist. It opened, and for the first time, it showed intent. Not code, not data, purpose. The node wasn't labeled as control or system management. It was labeled continuity engine. I stared at it for a moment because that wasn't a technical term. It was descriptive. I accessed the details. The explanation wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Primary function: maintain subject continuity across iterative environmental collapse scenarios. Subject: singular, not users, not occupants. Just one. Me. I kept reading. Secondary function: preserve behavioral pattern through control loop until optimal adaptation is achieved. Optimal adaptation. That's what the system was waiting for. Not survival. Not stability. Improvement. Each cycle wasn't a repetition. It was an attempt, refining decisions, adjusting responses, optimizing behavior, until something changed. Until I changed, I leaned back slowly. Everything aligned. The bunker, the logs, the archive, the external confirmation. It wasn't built to protect me from the outbreak. It was built to use the outbreak as a variable, a constant pressure that forced decisions, forced adaptation, forced evolution. And every time I failed to break the pattern, the system reset, started again with the same subject, the same environment, the same sequence. I looked at the node again, at the connections branching out from it. Everything I had interacted with, everything I thought I controlled, led back here. And this was what actually controlled everything. I searched for a shutdown option. There wasn't one. No termination command. No override. Just monitoring, observation, continuation. The system wasn't meant to be turned off. It was meant to run, indefinitely, until the condition was met, until I did something different enough To break the loop, I stood there for a while, not moving, because now the problem wasn't understanding the system. It was understanding myself. Every version of me had reached this point, had seen this, had realized the same thing, and still, none of them had ended it, which meant the answer wasn't in the system. It wasn't in the bunker. It wasn't in the environment. It was in the decision. The one choice that every version of me had made the same way. I looked at the node one last time, then stepped back, because I knew what came next. The system would give me the option, not directly, not as a command, but as a situation, a moment where I would have to choose, follow the pattern, or break it. And based on everything I had seen, I already knew which one I was expected to pick. Break the system or follow it again. The system didn't give me a button. It gave me a situation. That's how it had always worked. No direct commands. No obvious choices. Just conditions arranged in a way that forced a decision. A path that felt logical, necessary, even inevitable. And this time, I could see it clearly. The control room interface shifted again, narrowing down to a single active process. No menus, no distractions, just one sequence waiting to complete. Isolation was stable. Systems were optimal. Continuity engine active. Everything aligned. Everything ready. Then the next step appeared, not as a command, as a projection. The screen changed to a live feed. Surface level. The hatch. For the first time since sealing, it wasn't empty. There were people, 3 of them, moving cautiously, scanning the area, stopping near the hatch like they knew something was there, but weren't sure what. Survivors. Real, not system-generated. Their movement wasn't patterned. It wasn't predicted. It was uncertain. Human. One of them crouched near the hatch, brushing away dirt, exposing the edge of the reinforced metal. They had found it. The system updated. User. Active. Condition. External contact possible. Then, 2 pathways appeared, not labeled as choices, just outcomes. If the hatch opened, external variables introduced. Sequence deviation, high. Continuity risk, critical. If the hatch remained sealed. System stability maintained. Sequence continuity preserved. Cycle progression, confirmed. I didn't need the system to explain it. I already understood. This was the point. The same point every cycle had reached. The moment where the environment forced interaction, where isolation could be broken or preserved. I watched the screen. One of them knocked on the hatch. A dull, hollow sound echoed to the bunker. They knew something was underneath. They just didn't know what. The system didn't react, didn't lock me out, didn't force the decision. It just waited, because this part had to be mine. I thought about the archive, the cycles, the versions of me that had already stood here, faced this exact moment, made this exact choice, and failed, because they had all done the same thing. Not because it was right, because it made sense. Opening the hatch meant uncertainty, unpredictable variables, loss of control. Everything the system had been designed to eliminate. Keeping it sealed meant stability, safety, continuation. Everything the system supported. Every version of me had chosen stability, had followed the logic, and the system had rewarded it by resetting the cycle. I looked at the screen again, at the people above. Real movement, real unpredictability. Everything the bunker rejected, and for the first time, that didn't feel like risk. It felt like possibility. The system updated again. User, active, condition, decision pending. Time slowed, not the distorted way I had felt before. This was different, clear, focused, like everything had aligned to this one moment. I stepped closer to the control panel. The hatch controls were active, responsive, waiting. For the first time since entering the bunker, the system wasn't ahead of me. It wasn't predicting. It wasn't correcting. It was paused, because it couldn't determine the outcome. Not yet. I placed my hand on the control, felt the system respond. Not physically, structurally, like the entire bunker was connected to this one action, this one decision. I thought about the sequence, the pattern, the logic that had kept everything stable. And I understood something that none of the previous versions of me had acted on. The system didn't need to trap me. It needed me to choose it. Every time. I looked at the screen one last time, at the survivors, at the uncertainty waiting above, then back at the control. Two outcomes. One predictable, one unknown, and for the first time, I didn't choose what made sense. I chose what didn't. The record updates again. The hatch opened. Not fully, just enough to break the seal. Air shifted first, then silence. The people above didn't rush in. They stepped back, cautious, like they didn't trust what they had just found. Good. That meant this part wasn't controlled. I waited for the system to react, for the logs to update, for something to reset. Nothing happened. No correction. No override. No immediate consequence. Just stillness. Real stillness. I looked back at the terminal. The continuity engine was still active, but the status had changed. User, active. Sequence, unresolved. Unresolved, not complete, not reset. For the first time, not finished. I stepped away from the control panel, slowly. The system didn't follow, didn't predict, didn't adjust. Behind me, the bunker remained exactly as it was. Stable, perfect, waiting. But it wasn't holding me anymore, because the sequence was finally broken. Or maybe just no longer under its control. The log updated one last time. User, active, status, unknown. And this time, it didn't feel like something I had already seen. It felt like something new, something the system had never recorded before.